am so happy to be able to introduce my colleague and friend, Ilya Kliger, who is going to give a talk entitled Magnanimous Husbands, Repentant Wives, Sovereignty and Governmentality in Russian Domestic Fiction, the case of Polinka Saks. And I'm also very happy to introduce Harsha Ram of Berkeley, who will be our subsidiary discussant. Harsha needs to leave early, due to teaching commitments, but we're starting right on time. So please, yeah.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to present this somewhat mistitled paper with just a kind of caveat that it's sort of at the same time work in progress and also work that has been in progress for a very long time. It's kind of a spin-off of a larger book project, and I am, but in some ways the material is quite new and the approach is potentially also sort of experimental for me, and so I am really looking forward to your comments and kind of conceive of this if possible as a workshop. That would be super helpful for me. So okay, so I will launch into this with one of my favorite passages of all of 19th century Russian literature, in a memorable passage from Ivan Goncharov's Обыкновенная история from 1847. Pyotr Aduev instructs his nephew on the subtleties of enlightened patriarchy. Quote, "You have to mold a woman out of a girl according to a well-designed plan, a method of your own, so that she understands and plays the role she had been assigned. You must confine her with an invisible circle. You must contrive to take possession not only of her heart, but of her mind and her will, and subordinate her tastes and habits to your own, so that she sees everything through your eyes and thinks with your mind. Accord her freedom of action within her sphere, as long as you monitor vigilantly her every movement, every sigh, every action, so that each and every momentary mood change, outburst, the first sign of any feeling, always meets with the ever watchful eye of the husband. You have to maintain constant vigilance without tyranny, and it must be done subtly and without her noticing. And in this way, you will lead her in the desired direction." So in addition to being an obviously very skillful husband, the speaker of these words is also a factory owner, a highly ranked state official, and a mentor to his young nephew Alexander. As a Nikolaevian statesman named Pyotr, he modernizes, rationalizes, constructs a well-regulated state. As a factory owner, he has his workers whipped when they misbehave. As a mentor, he sometimes regrets not being able to do the same to his nephew and instead employs a richer repertoire of techniques. He chastises, disabuses, urges, predicts, and so on. As a husband, as we have seen, he subjects his young wife to relentless surveillance and effective control. The novel foregrounds the question of proper government at each of these levels, more or less. Since the nearly simultaneous publication in the 1980s of D.A. Miller's The Novel and the Police and Nancy Armstrong's Desire and Domestic Fiction, much theoretically informed work on 19th century European narrative has drawn on Michel Foucault's tripartite genealogy of modern regimes of power. This Foucauldian turn in literary studies depended on recognizing realist fiction as a refined medium for purveying social distinctions, exclusions, and norms, while in Armstrong's words, quote, relegating vast areas of culture to the status of aberrance and noise. Realist fiction, in other words, carries with it a certain discipline, a kind of power that, unlike its sovereign counterpart, refuses to announce itself as such. While early modern sovereignty depended on the theatrical display of majesty and on open ritualized acts of violence, Enlightenment discipline invented subtler methods of control, hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and the standardization of behaviors and roles. The reality to which realist fiction introduces its readers could then be understood in terms of these very techniques: authorial omniscience, rigid distribution of gender and social roles, and emphasis on the necessity of socialization. To invoke Pyotr Aduyev's words once again, realism done, quote, subtly and without the reader noticing, has the effect of, quote, constant vigilance without tyranny. One wonders how this Foucauldian turn would have played out had its early exponents been aware of Goncharov's first novel. To dwell on this thought experiment for a moment, we can imagine them, on the one hand, overjoyed at having found the kind of unambiguous articulation of disciplinary power that was rather unprecedented in the texts they themselves worked with. At the same time, this very clarity may have given them pause. After all, Foucault's account of disciplinarity, by contrast with its sovereign counterpart, stresses subtlety and covertness. From this point of view, Aduyev's explicit, self-satisfied articulation of disciplinary prowess directly belies the logic of discipline and begins to follow the script of sovereign power instead. As disciplinary power shades into the domain of sovereignty, it becomes visible and therefore open to challenge. This is exactly what happens when Aduyev's wife overhears his smug sermon and speaks back. So that's the kind of paradoxical moment that happens there, where what he's saying should not be said, right? It should be done, but not said openly, not overheard, and therefore not challenged. As we reach the novel's epilogue, we have clear evidence that the disciplinarian husband has gotten carried away. Here, the question is no longer whether Lizaveta Alexandrovna adequately fulfills her function as a wife. She certainly does, but whether she lives or dies. Discipline produces docile bodies and transparent souls on the disciplinary model, efficient workers, domestic women, but it does not kill. The power over life and death is the power of the sovereign, and the tableau the sentimental tableau specifically with its own tradition, the tableau at the end of the, at the center of the epilogue, the young woman languishing, grown pale, thin, lifeless, under the tutelage of her husband, alerts us once again to the workings of surplus sovereign violence under the veneer of enlightened disciplinary control. The epilogue does still more, however, by invoking the relevance of Foucault's third regime of power, which he designates variously as governmentality, pastoralism, biopolitics, or pastoralism. Within this regime, power concerns itself with promoting and regulating desire, self-interest, willful economic activity, and vitality itself. Its task is, in Foucault's words, to arouse, to facilitate, to laisser faire. It is the art of governing by withdrawing, or to sharpen the paradox, the art of making subjects follow their desires. And this idea of making subjects follow their desires is something that will reappear later in the analysis of Polin'ka Saks. Frightened by what he has done to his wife, Pyotr Aduyev now decides to dedicate himself to the task of reviving her. He plans to take her on a journey, begs her to express a single irrational wish, but finds her unable to do so. All she does is ask for more work, and grows pale and thin and keeps dying. As the novel ends, we are left wondering whether he will be able to master the governmental art of arousing her desire, facilitating her self-interest, replenishing her vital forces. It is one thing to domesticate his wife, to make her thoroughly internalize her role. It is another thing to compel her to live on. Thus, the domestic subplot of Обыкновенная История relies on and coordinates elements of disciplinary, governmental, and sovereign power regimes and their correlative scenarios of subjectivity. And I should say here probably that, and I return to this at the end in the kind of methodological conclusion, that I don't, that all of these categories in Foucault are obviously tangled and confused and receive different articulations over time and so on. And I'm really holding them lightly, as it were, thinking of them as heuristic devices more than statements of fact, without, of course, denying that he was getting at something, in fact, quite effectively, in my mind. But I'm also setting aside, and I'm happy to address in discussion, the long debates about whether or not Foucault is applicable in Russia, and so on. But this is, I think, it's important questions, but I just, there's no time to talk about it. But hopefully the paper will also suggest something in that regard. Another reason why I'm turning to Foucault here as well is that, if we look at our colleagues in Victorian studies, in French studies, who are looking at our 19th century material, they are really working with these theoretical paradigms, and have been for a long time, and have been developing them and so on. And I think there's no reason why we couldn't kind of enter into a dialogue about this. So while scholars of Western realism have recognized the workings of discipline and more recently of biopolitics for grasping the power dynamics of the texts in their corpus, sovereign power has been generally excluded from consideration. Once again, the assumption has been that sovereignty, with its spectacular scenarios of power, to use Richard Wortman's extremely suggestive, far-reaching term, heightened rhetoric of charisma and excessive acts of violence, could not be accommodated within the sociostatic parameters of realist prose. At best, its figurations could be located at the margins as that which is to be spurned and can be successfully avoided. In what follows, however, taking my cue from Obыкновенная История, I would like to ask whether a surplus of sovereignty can in fact be detected elsewhere in contemporary Russian fiction. In order to address this question, I will discuss several texts, translated and original, all published in Sovremennik the same year as Obыкновенная История. These texts, in addition to Obыкновенная История, are translations of Goethe's Elective Affinities, Dickens's Donby and Son, Alexander Herzen's Kto Vinovat, published in a supplement to one of the volumes published in its entirety. It had been published before, but republished in this text. The less well-known Pyotr Kudryavtsev's novella Без рассвета, epistolary novella, strange, interesting text. And finally, Druzhinin's Polin'ka Saks. So this is, Polinka Saks is the telos of this discussion, but it will take us a little bit of time to get there, just to set things up. A brief considerations of these texts yields three prominent motifs pertaining to the government of women within the family domain. The motif of female flight from domestic oppression. We find that in Dickens and Kudryavtsev. The motif of the ostensibly emancipated erotic arrangements in Goethe and Kto Vinovat. And the motif of the woman's education within marriage that we find in Druzhinin and in Goncharov. Druzhinin's text became the most culturally resonant treatment of the problem, and it will receive the most attention here, but the broader context of 1847 Sovremennik can serve both to highlight aspects of the novella that have received less critical attention, and also hopefully to begin making the case for a broader pattern within Russian domestic fiction. Okay, so I begin with the motif of flight, and here our actors are Donby and Son and Kudryavtsev's Без рассвета. So just to remind those who've read the novel, and this is a disastrously brief retelling, it is a story on some level of the downfall of a despotic father and husband who insists on, quote, domestic deference and submission and proclaims that his will is law. Donby treats his daughter Florence and his young wife Edith with frigid despotism, causing them both eventually to flee and thus precipitating the ruin of his fortune and reputation. At the end of the novel, we find Donby aged and chastened, living in the care of his daughter and her husband and doting on his grandchildren. So he's learned a lesson. Through Donby's biography, the narrative recounts and endorses the transition from patriarchal to companionate family relations based not on authority, but on affection. Sovereign rule expressed in the formula, my will is law, gives way to other types of relations of power. We have, on the one hand, disciplinary distribution of gender roles. Edith is exiled, has to be exiled from the narrative, even though her flight is completely justified, thoroughly understandable, and so on, but it generates too much anxiety in the text. And so she needs to be basically expelled to southern Italy, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, a rearrangement, pastoral redistribution of livelihood, supplying the retired Donby with a pension. He's now retired and bankrupt, but he receives a pension, which is a small part of what had been embezzled from him by the villainous advisor James Carker, and is now kind of coming back to him through a sort of money laundering effects of charity. I'll get back into that. I can get back to that in discussion. The motif of female flight plays out, as it were, in reverse in Kudryavtsev. At the center of this text is the figure of an unhappily married woman, Yelena Klokova, musing on her said predicament in a letter to her friend. It's an epistolary text. Yelena wonders how she could have agreed to marry a man she did not love. And her observations are extremely sharp and interesting in this regard. The roots of the disastrous mistake, she concludes, reach back to her upbringing, specifically to the tender solicitude with which her parents watched over her, instilled in her a sense that her happiness was their responsibility and not her own. Trusting their love, convinced that they were the true custodians of her flourishing, the young woman allowed herself to be persuaded, relinquishing her own will. So what's curious about this is that the father's not forcing her, right? Or there's an element of this, but really the point is that this kind of love turns into command, right? And that there's a kind of continuum between being loved and obeying in the case where her will is obviously against it. Now, trapped in this stifling marriage, she wonders whether the love and care with which she had been raised had only served to ensure her parents' total power over her. The emergence of the language of naked power from the discourse of pastoral care encapsulates the logic according to which the central plotline of the novella unfolds. After a number of painful experiences with her unloved and unlovable husband, she decides to seek shelter with her family. Upon arrival, however, she finds her father implacable, reasserting the iron logic of what Gail Rubin has called traffic in women. He demands that she return to her husband immediately. The gift cannot come back, right? That would be a travesty of the entire transaction. Elena decides to seek shelter with a friend, but becomes ill in the cold rain and dies on the road. So the elements kind of, as is often the case, the elements help out the father. Thus, in the reversal of the trajectory we found in Donby and Son, governmental care turns out to have been all along sovereign authority to coerce unto death. By contrast with the formidable paternal figures framing the female flight motif in Dickens and Kudryavtsev, the novels of Goethe and Herzen are essentially fatherless. Foregrounded here instead is the relatively free circulation of libidinal arrangements, akin to a combination of and recombination of chemical elements invoked in the titular notion of elective affinities. Instead of father figures, we find here prominent figures of mediation. The appropriately named Herr Mittler, who is a clergyman and self-appointed marriage counselor in elective affinities, and of course Dr. Krupov in Kto Vinovat. When the newlyweds Eduard and Charlotta ask Mittler whether or not they should invite Eduard's friend and Charlotta's niece to live with them on the estate, an invitation that will lead to all sorts of disasters, Mittler exclaims, "Do what you wish, it's all one. I've seen the most judicious plans miscarry and the absurdest succeed." Mittler gives voice to the novel's own governmental interest in letting things unfold, letting the elements combine and recombine. Towards the conclusion of the novel, we learn that Mittler, as a theorist of education and of government, in fact, is against prohibitions. He believes that prohibitions are bad. We can avoid them by stimulation of people rather than of forbidding things. Against the background of the sequence of tragic events ensuing from the initial invitation, the language of pastoral governmentality acquires profoundly ironic overtones. The novel thus enacts the principle of letting things play out, of releasing energy, and promoting new bonds, and in the same gesture stages utter helplessness in the face of the forces thus unleashed. Here, Mittler, the figure of this wise fool, always right and wrong at the same time, encapsulates this paradox, structuring the text as a whole. It both solicits and denies the kind of pastoral government that would be up to the task of regulating the energies it has released. In Herzen's novel, which is genetically related to Goethe, and again, I can talk about that separately, the figure of the mediator is equally central. So much so, in fact, that one glib answer to the question, the titular question of the novel, who is to blame, is simply Dr. Krupov, right? In an attempt to find employment for Dmitry Krutsifersky, Krupov facilitates the appointment of his appointment as tutor to a family where he will meet his wife Luba. Later in the novel, in the hopes of consoling culturally isolated Beltov, he introduces him to the recently married couple. Krupov brings people together, awakens affects and capacities, makes room for the formation of new bonds, all to tragic effects. The Krutsifersky marriage is a temperamental misalliance. The introduction of Beltov brings that misalliance disastrously to light. What lends Krupov's mediations an air of special haplessness is that he himself now attempts to undo the consequences of his actions. He tries to talk Krutsifersky out of marrying Luba. He lectures Luba on the sacred duties of motherhood when he begins to suspect that she is in love with Beltov. And finally, he demands that Beltov simply go away. The figure that had enabled mobility, facilitated encounters, promoted self-realization, now warns, admonishes, seeks to separate. Unlike Goethe's Mittler, who merely gives voice to the novel's experiment in libidinal laissez-faire, Krupov repeatedly intervenes, presenting us with a more robust image of pastoral government at the price of shading into sovereign prohibition. The third motif, finally, the motif of education for women within marriage, finally takes us to Polinka Saks. Here, it is helpful to contrast Druzhinin's account of such education with what we already see in Goncharov. While the disciplinarian Aduev relies on surveillance, enclosure, and control, Konstantin Saks acts in classical governmental fashion by modifying the environments of the subject, right? So not acting on the subject, but acting on the environment. He surrounds her with beautiful objects and books intended to awaken in her the capacity for growth. And when at one point he gives her a book and she tries to please him by trying to learn the book by heart, he's sort of shocked by this thoroughly Aduevian, sort of disciplinarian attitude towards education, right? His idea is you don't learn books by heart, right? You try to kind of enter into a relationship with them. Yes. So while another thing is that Saks is actually really likes moments, the things about Polinka that make Aduev really anxious about, that would make Aduev really anxious about his wife, namely what he calls signs of character, vitality and independence, occasional bouts of temper, a certain feistiness, biting her lip as she's arguing with him, a kind of anger, kind of energy. But of course, what distinguishes the husbands' approaches most clearly are their respective attitudes to infidelity. Aduev's discipline effectively forestalls such undesirable behavior on the part of his wife. And there's a very curious early reception of the novel that sort of points us in the direction of the possibility of adultery in that text as well, of the possibility of a triangle, sentimental triangle developing in that text as well. But Saks asks his wife, deliberately asks her to be attentive to the young man who will soon be her lover, and upon discovering her infidelity, performs the ultimate governmental act of letting go. While marital dynamics and female infidelity make up the main narrative thread of the novella and has received the lion's share of critical attention, I would like to dwell on two additional storylines woven into the central plot of marital education and release. First, like Petr Aduev, Saks works on behalf of the state, investigating cases of embezzlement in defense of the treasure and the common property. We are told that his efforts have compelled many corrupt high-standing officials to leave state service. From the very start, the text highlights the link between the husband's work to educate his wife and the statesman's work to uproot social evils. The entanglement grows even deeper when Saks departs on a new mission, leaving Polinka exposed to the advances of the handsome Prince Galitsky. As it turns out, the person Saks is called upon to prosecute for embezzlement, an official named Pisarenko, used to manage the estate of Galitsky's father. Galitsky contacts Pisarenko and bribes him to keep Saks away by confusing the investigation indefinitely. Now, with Saks occupied in the provincial town, Galitsky assails Polinka, who soon begins to return his passion. At least for a time, Saks loses control over both family affairs and affairs of the state. Curiously, he gets out of both predicaments in the same way, through an act of governmental magnanimity. He promises Pisarenko's wife to use his connections to help educate the criminal's children. And then out of gratitude for this, Pisarenko gives up his obfuscations and, in fact, moreover, tells Saks of Galitsky's scheme. This magnanimous act channels the benefits of the protagonist grants to another back to the protagonist himself. Thus understood, this sequence anticipates the kernel event of the novella as a whole. Saks gives Polinka her freedom and receives her eternal love in return. But of this more in a moment. For now, I would like to mention another thematic thread in Polinka Saks. This is the topic of estate management, crystallizing around the figure of Saks's correspondent, Zaleshin. Zaleshin is a benevolent hedonist who is unable to enjoy life on the estate until he has made his serfs prosperous, healthy, and fat. Happiness, he says, is extremely difficult to concentrate in oneself alone. A happy man is like a gas lamp. He throws out a circle of light all around for a certain distance. At the end of the novella, having granted Polinka a divorce, Saks plans to travel abroad and asks Zaleshin to take over the management of his estates. He instructs his friend to lighten the burden of the serfs, to help them prosper, and even to release some of them in accordance with the 1842 decree on obligated peasants. Thus, the novella sets up two images of emancipation side by side, domestic and political. On closer examination, however, we notice a fundamental disagreement between the two friends on the question of governmentality. And here I had to kind of cut out a bit of political economical discourse. There's language in Polinka Saks, which directs us to some of the articles that were written by Vladimir Milutin in that same year in Sovremennik, as well as the famous work by Eugène Buret on the misery of the working classes. We know that Druzhinin reads these texts. I can't go into detail into that whole kind of tangent, but what I'm trying to say is that a certain debate in political economy is being here reenacted between Zaleshin and Saks. As Saks makes clear to Zaleshin, government for him means something other than spreading one's own happiness to one's inferiors. It means active intervention, in fact, struggle. The privileged name for this struggle, for the object of the struggle, is общество. Общество brings forth corrupt officials and at the same time deliberately retards the development of promising young women like Polinka. As we have seen, the two struggles against corruption and for Polinka Saks are linked on the level of plot. The struggle for Polinka culminates with the confrontation between Saks and Galitsky, the ultimate man of society, as corrupt as, recall the incident with Pisarenko and his bribery, as he's elegant and charming. It is this confrontation, and in particular the scene of its resolution through the husband's act of magnanimous release, that constitutes the dramatic kernel of the novella. So the scene is carefully prepared, this pinnacle scene is carefully prepared and then narrated in two letters written by the lovers to their respective correspondents. In these letters, the figure of Saks undergoes a distinct heightening, transformed from an enamored husband, honest statesman, and decent man into a mysterious, charismatic figure, inspiring mystical dread. From the lover's starkly limited perspectives, we witness his opaque manipulations behind the scenes, arousing in them premonitions of approaching doom. Of course, it turns out that these manipulations were all of his ways of using his connections to get the divorce, which was obviously very difficult. Who can unpuzzle this fearsome, impenetrable man? Exclaims Polinka in a letter to a friend. Galitsky complains in his own letter that he's haunted by the figure of the, quote, provoked enemy with an implacable gaze with which no human eye can withstand without blinking. So we get a kind of melodramatic heightening of the protagonist, right? Almost the recoding of this one kind of husband into another kind of husband. The lovers are held in this state of suspense for a month, ostensibly because Saks wishes to test their love. Polinka stays in her room pretending to be ill on her husband's orders. And here, I'm not sure if Valeria Sobol is here or Katya Bowers, but resonances with the Gothic are prominent. She keeps him in the room, and Galitsky anticipates a bloody confrontation with Saks. At last, they are brought together in a gloomy old house in the middle of the woods. The location of the house is ominously specified. It's on the way to Schlüsselberg, the site of the famous political prison. The house has a majestic aura of the reign of Catherine II, complete with portraits of the important personages of the time. It also contains a number of, quote, busts of men with iron faces and long, well-combed hair. And here I would like to pause and publicly thank three art historian colleagues who helped me, and as a result to help the 19V forum, right? Because it sort of enables these things. But Margaret Shamu and Polly Blaxley and Alison Lee helped me look for this particular, bust, which is, as they confirmed, and correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret and others, it seems like a marked description, right? The busts have iron faces, okay, fine, but also hair rather than wig, long and carefully combed hair. So I think we're still looking, and I'm looking in Druzhinin for invocations of this. I would be grateful, of course, if somebody has insight into who they are. My own kind of guess for now is persistent but very badly educated, which is that what we're talking about Antoine Houdon's founding fathers, right? Who, Washington, Benjamin Franklin being the most famous one, and then Washington and Jefferson as well, which would be a strange, but I think extremely appropriate combination. The Catherinian connection between Houdon and Catherine is obvious, right? He makes a statue of Catherine. He gives her the Voltaire, and also, but also politically, there's a kind of strange mixture of republicanism and sort of constitutionalism here that's at stake, or republicanism and magnanimity, acts of magnanimity. In any case, this may be more for discussion. Of course, it also makes sense because he's about to release the lovers. Having thus held the lovers in terrified suspense, Saks nevertheless berates them for their fear. Do we live in Mexico or under feudal rule, he says? And it's another curious question, why Mexico, right? And actually, if we look at Sovremennik once again, we find for that year, earlier issues discussing Mexico, actually having stories about Mexico, giving travelogues from Mexico. So, there's a good chance that Mexico, as opposed to say Turkey, right, which would be the natural kind of reference point for where tyranny comes from, or despotism comes from, right? That's usually where people go at this point when they imagine Eastern. Anyway, so Mexico. He then hands Galitsky the divorce papers and pronounces the lovers absolutely free. Yet the Gothic setting, the prolonged suspense to which the lovers have been subjected, the husband's occulted machinations behind the scenes, the proximity of the prison, and the accrual of the husband's nearly supernatural charisma all belie the attempt to present the act of release in enlightened, non-Mexican, non-feudal terms. Rather, what we have here is a specific scenario of sovereign power, namely the scenario of magnanimity, triggering a barrage of requisite acclamations. Thus, Galitsky exclaims 3 times in the course of the epistolary description of the scene, "Praise be to Saks, eternal praise to this great man. Where to find gratitude worthy of this magnanimous man? If only I could, not now, but say in 5 years, die for this man." Right, so all of the acclamations one might expect. But what is perhaps most remarkable about the whole scene in Saks's final is Saks's final admonition to Galitsky. Remember, he says, no matter what you do, 2 eyes will be watching you. Wherever you go, I will follow you step by step. Woe to you if my child is unhappy. We thus have a highly unusual, but at the same time absolutely emblematic governmental scenario here. Happiness itself is turned into an edict whose non-obedience is punishable in dreadful ways. Not only does Saks continue to stand between the lovers, as it were psychologically, but he also keeps his promise by apparently following them everywhere they go. So there's another text that he writes, a drama or plan for drama on Saks prior to the story. And in that other text, there's a very long section about how Saks keeps reappearing in the lives of this couple and messing with their, with the plans, with Galitsky's plan. Every time Galitsky makes a plan that he thinks that Saks thinks will make Polinka unhappy, he will appeal to his connections in the state to be appointed governor in some province, or to be, to perform all sorts of great deeds. Here, there's only one episode, and in this episode, Galitsky follows them apparently invisible to a ball in Florence, returns back. Polinka returns early. He returns with Polinka and appears like an apparition to her and says, and inquires her into her state of mind. This ghostly appearance, proof itself of perpetual surveillance, recapitulates the earlier behind-the-scenes maneuvers for obtaining a divorce. The act of liberation and the act of subsequent haunting stand in the relationship of paradoxical equivalence and are further linked to Polinka's death. At the moment of this visit or visitation, Polinka realizes that she in fact loves and has always only loved her former husband alone. Her already poor health turns for the worse, and in a matter of months, she dies. Among her parting words to her correspondent is the following striking acclamation, yet another one, the final one. May God bless this man who in parting gives life, resurrects, finishes the education he has started. So, invoking Claude Lévi-Strauss's discussion of myth and tristropique, we can say that the novella produces a brilliant symbolic resolution to the real contradictions of governmental politics, and in the same gesture exposes that contradiction in the clearest terms. Saks releases his wife, binding her all the more inextricably to himself, lets her leave but haunts her, demands her happiness, and thereby kills her. And insofar as his struggle for Polinka's soul allegorizes the struggle with общество, he triumphs over its corrupting egoism, but by acknowledging that he has lost. So in order to highlight the distinctive characteristic of this solution, I want to turn to a very, very well-discussed subject of the relationship between Polinka Saks and the great inspiration for that novella, Jacques, by Georges Sand, the 1835 novel, Jacques. And again, I have to leave out a lot, just a few very quick points to stay on time. Polinka Saks and Jacques share a number of conspicuous features. Foremost among them, of course, is the readiness of both husbands to renounce patriarchal authority, to make room for the heroine's pursuit of self-realization and love. At the same time, as husbands, the elder men with greater social, political, and economic capital, they maintain positions of superiority, overseeing and to an extent influencing their wives' journey to maturity. Both men take on the role of the woman's custodian and protector against the corruptions of society. Both women are childlike and innocent. Both turn out at some point to be unworthy of their idealized husbands. Differences between the texts are also range from subtle to striking. To begin with, Saks's education methods and goals are more interventionist from the start. He hopes to turn young Polinka into a worthy companion, a helper in his struggle with society. Though Jacques' wife Fernande and Polinka are of approximately the same age, and though both are referred to as children repeatedly and insistently, the latter is more thoroughly infantilized because a child for Sand is a Rousseauian sauvage, and there's no need to do anything to the child. For Saks, the child needs to be educated, brought up, and brought up to date. So Saks all Jacques wants is for her to be sincere, truthful, happy, wealthy, right? Whereas what Saks wants is for a companion in his struggle against society. A still more telling difference pertains to the respective methods of release, of course, and this is at the very center, right? So Jacques arranges for his wife's happiness behind the scenes and disappears, right? Commits suicide. Saks provokes near mystical dread while the young couple await his decision for a month, then stages an elaborate ritual of emancipation, and then haunts the lovers indefinitely to ensure absolute adherence to his decree on happiness. The suicide of the husband in Jacques dramatizes the evanescence of sovereign authority vis-à-vis the desiring individual, a kind of grand governmental fantasy. Druzhinin inserts this governmental script into the scenario of sovereign magnanimity, in which the heroine is released and at once all the more surely recaptured. Coded with the political imaginary of sovereignty, the story of emancipation. Oh, I reached my limit. Harsha, maybe I will finish this paragraph and then stop. Yeah. So coded within the political imaginary of sovereignty, the story of emancipation inspires in the heroine death-dealing devotion while granting the emancipator nearly supernatural reach into the life of the ostensibly emancipated subject. And I have some methodological postscript at a couple more pages, but we can turn to that in discussion and just let Harsha speak. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I'm going to introduce Harsha Ram, our discussant. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ilya. And I'm sorry that you had to cut off the final section of your talk, but in fact, I reference it in my own observations, and perhaps you can come back to it in the conversation as well. So my compliments to Ilya for a very rich and serious intervention that I enjoyed reading very much and reflecting upon over the weekend, which came as a very welcome respite from election madness. Thank you again for giving me this chance to read it. It seems to me that Ilya's argument can be broken down into three components. Firstly, a theoretical premise, which was taken from Michel Foucault, which involves the classification and genealogy of political power operating in modern Europe, in order to pose the additional question, which is vital to us as Slavists, of whether this model also obtains in Russia, and if not, why not? Secondly, he asked the question of how this organization of power relates to spheres that are outside the state, properly speaking, specifically how it affects or impinges upon marriage and the family as an institution. And then thirdly, Ilya asks how these two questions relate to what he calls domestic fiction, both European and Russian, and specifically a cluster of texts published in the journal Sovremennik in 1847, as well as some of the intertextual references to French and German literature. So let me quickly recap Foucault's tripartite model and then move on to some comments. So we have, on the one hand, sovereign power is embodied in a kind of unitary figure, characterized by the right to exercise coercion, punishment, and repressive control, and which is manifested principally by taking away, by some form of privative action. Secondly, we have disciplinary power, which is realized by scientific, moral, and other discourses, as well as institutions, and which is affected not so much by laws, but by norms. It shapes and regulates individuals and favors corrective and therapeutic techniques. These techniques can often be verbal, such as reading for edification, or secular forms of the confessional genre, such as the exchange of letters or the writing of diaries. And finally, we have governmentality or biopower, which organizes bodies, national populations, their biological and social life. It is interested primarily in the vitality of people, and it works also by letting go. So it's worth remembering that Foucault's model is at once a synchronic classification, but also a historical genealogy. In other words, it allows for the co-presence of all three elements, but also argues that in the West, sovereign power has been gradually complemented and partially replaced by governmentality, a power that is less interested in taking life than in regulating vitality. In some, though this is obviously far truer of Western Europe than, say, of Trump's America, we have moved from a state that executes criminal offenders to one that tells you when and whether to wear a mask or to self-isolate. So it seems to me the two big questions that Ilya asks are in essence the following. Does this European pattern obtain in Russia? And secondly, how does this political model relate to domestic life and then to domestic fiction as a literary problem? From his examination of a series of Russian literary texts, Ilya finds a distinct pattern. According to this pattern, the Western disciplinary and governmental scripts undergo what Ilya calls a kind of defamation on Russian soil, generating what Ilya calls a hybrid structure involving, I quote, a surplus of sovereignty, an added scenario of power over life and death, to quote Richard Wortman, a spectacular reassertion of authority, and an act of coercion. Ilya then sees all of this as historically symptomatic of, again, I quote, the persistence in Russia of the Ancien Régime and the symbiotic relationship that prevailed between cultural producers and the autocratic state. So several questions arise for me from Ilya's hypothesis. Firstly, is this novelistic manifestation of Russian sovereign power a throwback, a symptomatic regression to a pre-modern or early modern Russia as represented by the 16th century Muscovy of the Domostroy? Or rather, does it reflect the contradictions not of Muscovy, but of post-Petrine autocracy, which can be seen as characterized by a kind of paradox, that of being at once modernizing and regressive, reformist, yet also reactionary? In other words, Ilya, is the sovereignty you discuss radically archaic, that is to say non-modern, or simply regressive, like so many other aspects of 19th century Russia, including most obviously serfdom? As far as I can see, Ilya's argument points to a regressive modernity. And in this sense, Druzhinin's hero Saks ably captures the paradoxes of his own time, a Petrine modernity that is at once reformist and authoritarian. Yet it remains to be seen how exactly Petrine absolutism relates to the domestic sphere of the Russian nobility. As Ilya notes, Druzhinin's Polinka Saks in fact references multiple spheres of power, all in principle relatively autonomous: the state bureaucracy and its functionaries, the gentry estate and its peasants, and the gentry family and its dysfunctional and adulterous marriages. Are all of these distinct institutions structurally analogous in being subordinated to a sovereign power? Is the gentry paterfamilias sovereign in a manner similar to the Tsar? The sovereignty, in other words, functions similarly in the sphere of estate management and family relations as in the state. If this is true, then Ilya's argument reverses the assumptions of as noted a cultural historian as Yuri Lotman, for whom gentry life, whether on the country estate or in the urban salon, offered the educated nobility a release from the constraints of state service and court society. For Ilya, this release, I assume, would be an illusion, for the antinomies of private and public life turn out to be equally subordinate to governmentality or sovereign power. Now, such an argument would certainly risk becoming a form of social scientific functionalism, were it not for the fact that the family, like the state bureaucracy and the gentry estate, turns out to be the site of wildly unmanageable contradictions. This is why the domestic plot, I suggest, remains so strangely and weirdly productive in literary terms. In Druzhinin's story, Polinka bears the impossible burden of gentry womanhood that we already know from Pushkin's Tatyana. She has to be cultivated but not learned, seductive enough to attract the attention of the opposite sex, yet self-possessed and self-restraining. She has to be intelligent interlocutor to her husband, even as she's entirely cut off from the realms of professional activity that define his wider culture. On this already impossible burden, Polinka's husband Saks imposes the additional imperative of an externally induced as well as accelerated maturation. Polinka must at all costs be quickly transformed from a child, rybionek, into a woman. And it is her growth that provides Druzhinin's Druzhinin's story its narrative arc. Now, I believe Ilya makes a convincing case for regarding Polinka's Bildung as an example of a kind of fusion of disciplinary and governmental power that enables to the very degree that it also constrains. The result of a radically updated and emancipatory aesthetic education that includes even the recent novels of Georges Sand, her growth must, if it is to succeed in Saks's eyes, at the same time be miraculously reconciled with and contained by the institution of marriage and conjugal love. It is the failure of disciplinary power to induce an imported form of Bildung on Russian soil that precipitates Saks's regression to sovereign power. Although Saks's sovereignty occludes its own violence by pretending to liberate its own chosen object, even as it haunts her final days. There is much here, I think, that resonates more widely, justifying, I think, Ilya's most radical claim, which is to read Druzhinin's novella as a kind of allegory of Russian modernity writ large. Let me end then by asking two quick questions for Ilya. The first relating, and they both in a sense relate to the final closing pages, which unfortunately Ilya wasn't able to share with you, but I think that this could be a nice way of segueing into a discussion, which unfortunately I won't be able to participate in because I have to go and teach in 5 minutes. But let me quickly ask the questions and then leave you. Firstly, I wonder if what you perceive as the extreme proximity in the Russian social imaginary of the domestic and the political is also the result of what I might call an absent mediation. The missing third element here being the public sphere. It might be interesting in this context to go back to Habermas's account of the European public sphere as it emerges out of the transformations in the relationship between the classical, originally Greek polis and the oikos, in order to think about how and whether modern Russia evolves differently. What's interesting to note is that the absent public sphere was very much a concern for Belinsky and the natural school over the course of the 1840s. Secondly, I wonder, Ilya, if you have thought about how the misplaced idea of women's education becomes reflected in Russian letters, not merely as a kind of distorted ideology, but also as a distortion of literary form itself. Formally speaking, Druzhinin's novella unfolds as a series of epistolary exchanges interspersed with omniscient narration. This mode is familiar to us from contemporary European fiction, both sentimental and romantic, but what more could be said about the novella's Russian specificity? Ilya notes, and I think rightly so, the striking escalation of Gothic motifs in the story's closing section. And I would agree that this regression clearly encodes a kind of move back towards the enlightened absolutism of Catherinian Russia. And it's generally true that the Gothic as a literary mode is also a way of thinking about the kind of unresolved contradictions of a kind of congealed past. But I wonder what more could be said in formal terms about the convergence of the epistolary, the Gothic, and the Bildungsroman on Russian soil, and how that might relate to the kind of distortions that produce a kind of different model of power on Russian soil. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Harsha, thank you so much. Ilya,
Thank you very much.
say.
Okay, Harsha, and without, we will not keep you.
Thank you. All right, so I'll just say goodbye then. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you. Hi. So, should I reply to absent Harsha?
I think, Ilya, we would be really interested to hear what you have to say in response to Harsha's questions.
I mean, I think, yeah, there's this sort of excellent questions. I think the question about absent mediation is absolutely on point, and I think that we have that very obvious kind of, in pretty much all of the texts that I've looked at, the Russian texts that I've looked at, and especially in Polinka Saks and Обыкновенная история, what we find is again, you know, a kind of by now familiar conceptualization of the public sphere as общество, right? This really disgusting thing called общество, this annoying thing that one must correct, fix, that's corrupt, that's, you know, that's really the source of all evil, this общество, right? So, you know, in Обыкновенная история, this works somewhat differently, and this has different consequences. But here in Polinka Saks, you know, that it's everywhere. I think it's everywhere, and I think that the problem, the relationship between state and society, good for the most part state and, you know, horrible corrupt society, as represented in this text, is one that is projected into the domestic sphere as the adulterous triangle, right? As the triangle between the struggle between the statesman, the society man over, and the society man over the soul of this beautiful child, Polinka, right? And, you know, and basically what's really curious, I think, is the means by which the state both loses and wins in this particular struggle. So that's as far as mediation is concerned. And then as far as that one is really fascinating, I think, and I don't know quite, I haven't thought about it enough, this question of how formal, in other words, how, or I think even generic is what Harsha was asking, these generic combinations or modal combinations that come together and how they interact with each other in I think there's an answer to this question, or like beginnings to an answer to this question. Just an indication, right? So how do we think of the omniscient interruptions, right? One looks at both, no, in fact, Polinka Saks has a number of these moments of omniscience, right? And what one needs to look at, and now I will, thanks to Harsha, is, you know, what is the function of those more than, in addition to just filling in the gaps that the author seems unable to quite do in purely epistolary form. And then, you know, it's funny because, for example, Без рассвета is also a very curious generic combination. In Без рассвета we have epistolary exchange all the way through, and then the final scene is a drama. So we get, you know, so the author, the narrator tells us, the author, implied author tells us how things played out between Yelena and her father. You will find out from the following scene. And then we have a one-act play of the encounter between Yelena and her father. Why? Why do we switch to a different genre for this particular account? Again, I have thoughts about this, but I'm just not sure we have to talk about it, given that I assume not very many people read the text. So yeah, and then the Gothic, I would be very curious to hear what the Gothic contingent in this group has to say. To my mind, there's a way in which the Gothic often seems to kind of bulwark the sovereign in when it appears in these texts, in some of these texts, right? Just like the melodramatic bulwarks the sovereign. And again, curious fact that, right? Because Foucault makes this clear, and in general, we are sort of, we are used to thinking of the sovereign, and I will end there. We're used to thinking of sovereignty as something that is dramatized, that, you know, tautological, dramatized in drama and tragedy specifically, right? Classical tragedy. So, so the questions of legitimacy and illegitimacy, questions of usurpation, questions of lawful and non-lawful government, questions of the two bodies of the king, right? All of these questions are negotiated in tragedy traditionally. What what I find quite curious in the Russian tradition is how these elements reappear again and again and again in Russian texts, and reappear and deform what we're used to think of as the novel, or what we used to think of as realist prose, where these sorts of issues are not supposed to be addressed. It's in bad taste to talk about that stuff in realist prose. So then I will end with that. Thank you, everybody. And yeah, I'm not sure if there are any questions or.
I'm sure there are questions, Ilya. Thank you so much. Sasha will help us moderate the question process. So I'm going to open the floor.
Absolutely. So I'm going to open up the chat with everyone, to everyone now, and we already have a few questions. So Bella, Gregorian, if you'd like to go ahead, you can unmute yourself.
Good timing. Thanks, Sasha. Ilya, thank you for this beautiful talk. And Harsha, thank you for the comments. I know you're not here, but this was
Harsha.
This was really, really lovely, both the talk and the comments. So I have kind of two I don't know, questions, thoughts in the spirit of keeping this a bit workshop-like also. So the first piece has to do with the public sphere question that Harsha brought up. And I think that is a really central question, but I think it's actually intimately connected to the formal question, which is to say, it's, to my mind anyway, intimately connected to the epistolary. Because, like, for instance, I think of Michael Warner's early book on early modern America, and how epistolary, performance, readership, the way in which epistolary regimes of discourse impose a kind of mutual surveillance or coerce the participants into a kind of discursive space of mutual surveillance. That is basically a simulation of a literary public sphere. It also a political public sphere. So I was wondering if you are also thinking of a text like Biedные люди, that's like so explicitly about reading. And I'm wondering, I guess, what to do with the late 1840s absolutism and epistolary. Because by placing these persons into this particular environment, what's the text doing? Like, is it, are they performing a certain kind of personhood for the reading public? Are they mutually surveilling one another for the kind of disciplinary operations that you mentioned? I don't know, because because public sphere tends to be theorized for Republican constitutional societies, not for absolutism so as much. So I'm curious, for my own reasons, about what you would say about an absolutist public sphere. And then my second question is, so the texts you refer to, particularly Nancy Armstrong, like the Desire book, is really invested in like basically making a claim about citizenship and subjecthood, right? Like kind of one of the main points of that book is actually the English middle class woman is the modern political subject. So I'm wondering, who is Russia's modern political subject? In other words, I'm wondering, particularly in Polinka, where do you, like, what kinds of subjecthoods do you see? Because I thought the analysis of Saks is beautiful, is lovely, and it suggests certain things about, you know, possibilities or the kind of abortedness, if you will, of liberal subjecthood, right, in the Russian case, and I'm just wondering, like, who is your middle-class English woman? Do you know what I mean? If for Armstrong,
yeah.
And kind of relatedly, I don't know if you want to go here, but it's of course also very explicitly an imperial text, because Saks became Saks in the Caucasus. It's said over and over and over again throughout the novella. So I wonder how that figures into things as well. Like if it's a, you know, if there's a way to bring together a kind of absolutist Russian imperial, like kind of a poetics of an absolutist Russian imperial modernity, by thinking both about the aesthetics of the text and the political content.
Mhm.
And again, thank you so much. This was really enjoyable.
Thank you so much, Bella. Very thought-provoking comments. I'll start with number 3. What your comment reminds me of is the fact that we have a similar situation with Jacques, because Jacques, becomes who he becomes in Napoleonic Wars, right? So Jacques is an officer, a military man, and so on. Yes, I have to think about this. And I have to look again at exactly what I remember we have, I remember that there's invocation of the Caucasus in various ways. Even Galitsky and Saks seem to have fought together. I am not 100% sure he became, presumably, yeah. Let me look back at his career. And then, who is the middle class? That's a great question. The middle class subject. In fact, not just Armstrong, but I think I am thinking more closely with Margaret Cohen in some ways, right? Because of the prominence of, among other things, specifically sentimental scenarios that we're dealing with here, triangles and dynamics of allegorization of liberal subjecthood as caught between demands of duty and pools of desire, right? This kind of neoclassical updating of this kind of neoclassical thing for the French context, for the context of the sentimentalist novels written in France by women. So Cohen also says, right, the woman in the sentimental triangle is the modern subject. And for me, it's exactly the same. Polinka is my modern subject, right? And it's sad, but it's true. It seems that or Alexander Aduyev and Lizaveta Alexander, right? So in other words, these people who are growing up in the tutelage, under the tutelage of these mentors, are what the modern subjects are, or what they reappear as. And this, I guess, is where my kind of thoughts that with which I was going to conclude, and I didn't get to talk about this. I was going to mention the work of Roberto Schwartz and his great idea, and Harsha mentioned this, the notion of a misplaced idea in Roberto Schwartz. Roberto Schwartz is writing about Brazil, and he's writing about the importation of the novel to Brazil in the end of the 19th century, and the importation of liberal ideas to Brazil. And he's asking himself the question, what happens when you bring ideas of freedom, liberty, labor, and so on into a society which is slave owning and whose main social organization is a relationship between patron and client, right? So what happens to these ideas when they are misplaced? And so part of his answer, I think his answer is both really brilliant and also in a way, for me, a little bit too abstract, which is that what happens to these ideas is that there's that they undergo the process of untangling or kind of unhinging of the signifier from the signified, right? Because the sign and the referent, because they so obviously don't apply, right? And then that mirrors back to the continent of the origin of these ideas, to Europe, all of the ways in which they also don't, like a kind of anti-boomerang effect, right? Like a kind of, a way in which it comes back and sort of the Europeans now have to face all the different ways in which these concepts are really parodies of themselves. And so he links the work of Machado de Assis to this, and the language, the particular kind of language, and so on. It's really a brilliant article for those of you, many of you probably know it. And I was thinking alongside, for the Russian case, what is happening there, and what happens to these misplaced idea of, let's say, governmental rule or disciplinary rule, and misplaced and so precisely insofar as they come, and even the novel, right? Or realist fiction for that matter, right? How can we see this as a misplaced idea in a certain sense? And again, not to pose a dichotomy between Russia and the West here that would be re-rarefied, but rather to, precisely in Schwartzian mode, to sort of, ideas are misplaced everywhere, right? Ultimately, that's their predicament, to be misplaced to a certain extent. But some situations in which ideas appear bring to the foreground their misplacedness, right? So in this case, what we have is we have the notion of the novel, or the genre of the novel, that shows up in this sphere where the social imaginary of the cultural producers is really preoccupied with not only autocracy, who's constantly there, constantly participating, but even just the autocrat, right? As simply as that, right? Right. So what happens to these forms? What happened to these subjects? They begin to look like that, right, in this new context. And then the question is, does that mean mirroring back? Does that then mirror back the subjection, right? And or rather, does that remind the disciplinarians and the governmentalists of the fundamental rootedness of these techniques in sovereignty, right, in violence? And I think that would be the way in which Schwartz would go about this. I think I would go about it slightly differently, if I may say that, namely that I would, again, this is where I want to introduce, instead of the atomistic notion of a misplaced idea, a kind of Foucauldian, quasi-Foucauldian notion of regime, or Castoriadis's notion of social imaginary, right, where what's actually a kind of more holistic or horizontal, rather, in terms of phenomenological horizon, conception of what of how subjectivity, or what subjectivity is. And then with the help of that, you can see, I think, more that what is taking place is a recoding of subjectivity into a different social imaginary, in which one example is, okay, what happens to an enlightened husband when he is no longer an fabulously wealthy French aristocrat, nobleman, independent nobleman, but a servant of the state? What happens? How does that recode the subjectivity, or contribute to recoding the subjectivity, or make certain other scenarios compelling, right? Not necessarily one particular scenario, but gives another repertoire of scenarios to this particular enlightened figure of enlightened husband. And similarly, we could say, what happens to the wife of this husband as opposed to the wife of that husband, right? And what scenarios of tutelage or education are available to her. I spoke too long, but yes, and thank you also, Bella, for these very interesting thoughts about the public sphere. I think I find, again, I have to think more about this, but I find Wirtschafter's idea of the civics sphere rather than the public sphere more useful in some ways here, precisely because of its kind of entanglement with politics, with power. That's more direct. So, but again, entanglement, cooperation as well as contention, right? So civic would be mine. Yeah, and you seem to kind of agree. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. I fall silent.
We have a question from Alexei Vdovin. I have a question for Ilya. Thank you very much for an interesting and inspiring talk. I'm interested in how you treat the function of governmentality in George Sand's Jock and Polinka Saks. Is the governmentality discernible and palpable in French counterpart or not? If not, what stands for it in Sand?
Great, thank you, Alexei. Yes, I think it is discernible. It is, when I looked at Jacques, carefully looking for these very questions, like question of management of the estate, for example. There are passages where we are told how he manages the estate, and that management does mirror, to an extent, his management of his wife, right? Not surprisingly. And so I do think that from that point of view, governmentality is thematized, but not as prominently as in Saks, right? Not as prominently. And I think what happens there is that once we read Saks, which is a rewriting of Jacques, we can then project back onto Jacques a whole set of fantasies which are extraordinarily emblematic for governmentality, like this idea of the husband who kills himself, right? It arranges for the wife's happiness and just eliminates himself, right? That is such a kind of wonderful fantasy for what pure governmentality would look like. It is, of course, totally absurd, right? Because it is, well, for various reasons. The Russian, Alexei, as you know better than me, the Russian translation of Jacques comes out in 1844, and the translation cuts out the suicide sections, in addition to a number of other sections. So, you know, those Russians who read it in Russian probably were not aware, though I'm sure the suicide plot just spread culturally, just kind of spread like a disease. But then, you know, the essay is mistitled. My own essay is mistitled somewhat because I wanted to talk actually about the afterlife of Polinka Saks. I wanted to talk about happy family happiness, and Avdeev's Podvodny Kamen, and Turgenev's Punin and Baburin. All of these moments when the husband releases the wife, and then the wife says, "Okay, I'm coming back," right? So that motif. Not the Jacques suicide motif that we find in Что делать, but rather the Polinka Saks, which becomes actually more prominent than the Jacques. So Polinka Saks's rewriting of Jacques is I think more productive for the Russian case. The plot of magnanimous husband releasing the wife, and then the wife saying, "Oh no, sorry, why didn't you force me to stay with you?" Like in family happiness, right? Or other cases. So stuff like that. But yes, Alexei, sorry, I'm not quite sure I'm answering your question, but you know, I think that what is yeah, I shouldn't keep going. Thank you. Sorry, and we can reconnect if it wasn't clear.
We have a question from Valeria Sobol. Valeria, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you. This is really a question, and I'm sorry, it's going to be probably just some random thoughts maybe, but obviously I felt like I was called on because of the Gothic comment. But I'll start with the Empire, and I do agree with Bella that there's something going on there. Even Galitsky is clearly Polish nobility, right? And Saks, maybe Baltic German, I don't know, and it's not thematized in the work. But it's kind of fascinating that we have that, you know, the two rivals are represented by those, margins of the empire, if that's the case. But this is kind of a side comment. As for the Gothic, yeah, as you know, I just reread the novella. I was just absolutely blown away by both the lovesickness part and the Gothic part, and there's so much to think about. But I think you're right. Basically, in the second part, Saks is recoded as a Gothic villain. That's as simple as that from the kind of traditional genre, right? The mysterious, right, tyrant who keeps the young maiden at his power in a scary house, right? And she doesn't know what's going on. All these страшные люди come and go, right? What is good? Also, there is this weird, semi-incestuous theme with she's his daughter. I mean, a child.
Oh yeah.
Wife. He tells the guy, he's kind of, don't just give me my wife, I'm giving my child. Make sure you treat her well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just at the moment when he's about to release her, he adds that he's also a father.
Yeah.
Right. So the authority simultaneously is given and accrued, right? Which again mirrors that logic. Yeah. Sorry.
No. It's just thought. Yeah, exactly. And I don't think, I don't have much beyond the, in terms of Gothic component, that indeed it kind of invokes all this themes of regression, of, you know, opposite enlightenment. It kind of undercuts his whole like idea of enlightened figure and this magnanimous emancipationism, right? It just works against this whole, because of this association with darkness, with tyranny, with you know, irrationality, right? And possible dark desire. And speaking of child, cooking his child, it's very strange. We never quite get, like, I mean, do they have sex? He always says he always stays awake when she's sleeping, looks at her while she's sleeping. He works at night all the time and treats her as a child. She never gets pregnant. I mean, I don't know. There is some kind of strange, and this is kind of maybe parallel to Duyov not really fulfilling his wife's emotional sexual needs as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just going all over the place. I don't know. I was just so blown away by this work. But I think, yeah, and of course, his whole act of emancipation happens in the most repressive form possible, because she's supposed to sign this document not knowing what it is. And it's probably a divorce paper, right? But he specifically tells her to sign it without reading. So this is liberation through ultimate tyranny, which of course, as you said, is confirmed by his like haunting her and watching her. So I don't have anything like, I don't think Gothic, maybe there is more, but I think that whole complex of themes, traditional associated with the genre, with the darkness, the tyranny, and it sort of, works against his whole positioning himself as this enlightened husband, benevolently setting her free. So, and of course, I think in terms of hybrid model, because this regulating the behavior in both cases in Goncharov and Druzhinin also becomes privative, because it both kills the women, right? In both cases. So there was this more, you know, sovereign, violent aspect of power manifested as well. So yeah, just some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Lera. Yeah, there was one thing that I wanted to respond to, but I forgot. So I will write to you.
We have a question from Jennifer Flaherty. Jennifer, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thanks. Thanks, Ilya. Really interesting. Really loved hearing about it. I wanted to actually go back to the negative общество as mediator of public/civic sphere, and also back to your comments at the beginning of your talk about, well, in my mind, kind of language, you know, in the sense of if governmentality is that form of power that does not speak itself. So, and the way that these two things connect in my mind is, it seems to me that part of the problem with общество is its conventionality. And this might relate as well to the misplaced idea that you were talking about. But conventionality is being sort of inescapably, I mean, language is inescapably conventional. And общество is being sort of so sunk into language that it sort of detaches from, you know, from any kind of groundedness. So I'm wondering, you know, and it just seems to me that the inverse of that, what is then valued as the positive corollary, could go in sort of either way on Foucault's regimes. And I'm wondering, you know, which, so either sort of towards pastoral power as being the kind of vitalism that is a kind of the elliptical silence sort of associated with the peasantry, things like that, or going towards sovereign power as being sort of forthright. So it's language, but something that doesn't sort of leave any excess, that doesn't imply the dividedness of conventionality in общество's case, where sort of language becomes just sort of words floating in the air. So I'm wondering about that connection, and I'm also just curious to hear, you know, you return to those comments at the beginning about, you know, about what is speaking itself and what is not, and what does that mean for Russian realism, as opposed to, you know, these models of other European realisms, where it's very much about power that doesn't speak itself. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Also super thought-provoking. Strangely, it makes me it makes me think of Walter Benjamin's reading of elective affinities, which is the certain way in which, and in general, I think also with my texts that I'm looking at, the way in which nature and sovereignty become connected over the head of society, right? The way in which sort of, and you could also think of like citizen subject kind of model, right? Where you have, maybe Rousseauist, right, model, where you have precisely as you said, it's really, I think, astute, like this idea that somehow we can avoid conventionality either in silence or in forthright speech, but silence and forthright speech are one, right, in a certain sense, or are connected, and then and that's yeah, I have to think about the way that 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 these texts that I was looking at, I wasn't looking at the way in which they thematize language. But if I now start thinking about it, okay, no, I will have to go home and think about it. Thank you. Yeah, but I did want to point out that there is some way in which the relationship to the natural, right? So both Jacques and Saks want to protect their wives, their younger women, their children, for both are children, from becoming part of society, right? So society, they don't want them to be socialized. They precisely don't want socialization, unlike, again, this male logic, right? What they want is they want them to be nature and themselves to be sovereign, right? And they want that relationship. But what that means more like far-reachingly, I think this suggests a lot of things in my head, but I have to think it through. I mean, among other things, it suggests, for example, we were just reading Gleb Uspensky with you, right? And it suggests the relationship between the notion of the elemental force, right, and and sovereign power, right, and the way in which that keeps re-emerging in 19th century texts, from Herzen to everybody, right? The idea that you can right, if there's no sovereign, nature will do its job, right? By killing, infecting, pouring rain and so on. Okay, that's it, I stop. Thank you.
So we have a couple more questions. Ilya, are you okay with going for just a few more minutes? Okay, great. So Hilda Hugenboom, if you'd like to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Good to see you, Hilda.
Hi, Ilya. I sent you a note in case I didn't get my turn. This has been one of just a truly fabulous talk. Thank you so much. And I wanted to suggest that I mean this whole, I love the idea. It's all trying to map all of these different European possibilities onto the Russian novel, while trying to account for Russian specificity, the whole service apparatus, and of course serfdom. And I think he's pitting George Sand against the real biggies in the room, which are Richardson's Clarissa and Rousseau's Julie. And he mentions, when will Russia have will Russia ever have its own? Because Jacques is, Sand is still small potatoes at that point, compared to the real biggies. And Druzhinin had just translated Jules Janin's new translation of Clarissa. That came out in the spec claim, it came out in the same year. You know, it seems to me like the biggest problem is how to, you know, if you go to Clarissa, it's an argument against divorce. It's for the duty to the father. Any woman who leaves home in Russian literature, the antecedent is always Clarissa, and so you have that woman problem in the European sphere, but in the Russia sphere, women get conflated with slaves and slavery and serfdom, and so how do you untangle all of that, right? So the Jacques story is really there for her to reject the Jacques story. The real problem is, does she recognize what an exemplary bureaucrat her husband is? Right, that's, you know, never mind, you know, the husband bit, but does she recognize what an exemplary job these men are doing?
Yeah, great, thank you. I did not know that that Druzhinin had translated Clarissa. Do you remember where it came out?
It's in the same year. I can give you the reference.
Okay. I'll find it. Yeah, thanks.
And that would be,
Wait,
you know, the Prévost translation was the main one that everyone read. And the Prévost translation is a narrativization of an epistolary novel in many ways that mutes some of the real horrors. So I haven't looked at the Janin. I don't actually know what Janin did and then what Druzhinin did with what Janin did.
Interesting, yeah.
More for us, Ilya.
Exactly. Thank you, and I will see you soon.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Bye.
And there was another question, Sasha, you mentioned, no?
So we had Anne had a question as well. Anne, if you'd like to ask your question.
Sure. First of all, thank you to all the people who've been posing the questions too. It's really, really interesting, productive discussion. My question is both naive and open-ended, and that is, and maybe would let you talk about this work in general. How do you see these patterns that you've identified? How do they develop or not develop over the course of the 19th century? How long does this persist? This tension that you're describing.
Yeah. Forever is what I want to say. Yeah, but in various ways, right? In sort of various ways. I mean, one again, this is so one of the reasons why I say forever is because the way that I conceived of the paper initially, you know, I will farcically compare myself to Lev Tolstoy, where, you know, he decides to write a novel about the returning Decembrist, right? And he writes a novel leading up to the secret societies, right? So my idea was to write a paper about magnanimous husbands, and I ended up writing a paper about one magnanimous husband, the first one, right? But you know, Punin Baburin is already 72, right? And we have and again, I haven't done the work quite yet, but we have very similar things happening there, you know, and with political implications, right? I believe it's Baburin, right, who is characterized as a Republican, right? And you know, he releases his wife, you know, whatever she wants, and then she comes back and works with him for his revolutionary cause. So I think some of these patterns persist. I mean, there are also, as far as bigger texts, like for example, Oblomov or Anna Karenina, right? You see it appear in both of those. For example, this motif of the, in kind of complicated ways of releasing the woman and thereby getting her back, even if only momentarily. The other, of course, the other thing, of course, that comes to mind periodically is, the husband will let you go, but the elements will get you, right? Is another motif that will appear connected to this, and of course, sort of over time. So yeah, I think it persists, and I think that for a number of reasons it is very vivid in the 40s because of this preoccupation with Sand, because of this kind of interest in sentimental genres, still very sort of prominently deep-seated things happening there. But I think it keeps going. Another interesting case is Обрыв, right? And there it's of course babushka and not the husband. But we also have this vision of, for example, Tushin, who doesn't care that she cheated on you. Cheated. She didn't cheat, right? But she had an extramarital affair. Anyway, thank you. I have to think about this.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Okay, we can wrap up now, or we do have a few more questions if you'd like to keep
I'm
going.
happy to go, but I don't want to keep you.
Oh, no, that's completely fine. Just want to make sure that you're not too experiencing too much.
No, I'm experiencing so much wonderful feedback.
Amazing. Okay. So we can go to Donna Orwin. Donna, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Ilya.
Hi, Dana.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. Just throwing in a comment, which is, I think this is on the political side. I think this is very much related to the political solution of the post-French Revolution issue in Russia, that how do we reconceptualize what politics is? And I think that the government comes up with an idea that politics, that the government is the same as a family. So the Tsar is Batushka. And the idea, and Vladimir Putin has conversations today, goes out and has television conversations with individuals. So that idea persists in some form. And I'm thinking of this as, so this is the Russian response, just like Frederick the Great had his response, conservative response to the idea of how do you form a post-French Revolution society. With Frederick, it was a completely militarized society. With Russia, there was this family idea. And I'm thinking of it as a kind of form of Rousseau's social contract, in which everybody has to agree. But of course, everybody won't agree. But actually, that's what this novel is about. It's I haven't read it for years, so now I have to go back and read it. It's interesting that what Saks wants to do is to educate Polinka, but in the end, he wants her to agree to come back. So that's the kind of dream of a perfect polity that if you want to look on the political side of things, that Druzhinin is playing with. And I think that it's very, I mean, if you look at the relationship, I wish Richard Wortman was still here. You look at the relationship between liberalism, which is a very different kind of political polity, and these more conservative forms of polity, I see for the first time how these kinds of works play into that as well. There's a cultural piece of it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's the whole kind of polity family metaphors. It's like super long-standing, obviously, and we have Отец Отечества in Peter, right, already, and so on. And so, yeah, I think the metaphor, even if there were no further thematizations of the various ways in which the family, what is happening within the family runs parallel to what is happening in the state management and parallel to what is happening in the state management. Even without that, right, we would be compelled as contemporary readers of those texts. We are not, but if we were, right, we would be compelled to read family relations as political allegories. I think this is just the cultural fact, right? But how we do it is a different question.
And we had a question from Maria Vinogradova. Maria, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. And thank you, Ilya, for the fascinating talk. I wonder if you have a comment about the history of Polinka Saks in the 20th century. So if my information is correct, the first time it was published was 1955. And in 1956, there was a radio drama produced based on it, which actually reinforces the point voiced by Bella Grigorian on surveillance as being related to epistolarity, because in that radio drama, letters are read, there are stolen letters, so they're read by people, by voices of people other than those who wrote the letters. So, and 1955, of course, is a very interesting year, so I wonder what it tells, you know, what its publication during this year tells about its place in the Soviet time in the 20th century. Thank you.
That's great. Can somebody answer? I mean, I really don't know about this. This would be super interesting to look at. But does anybody have? I mean, Maria, do you by any chance have any ideas about what the relevance? Yeah, I mean, did you see the play? Did you hear the play? Or you just know that it came out?
It's on the internet.
It's on the internet. So when they read these stolen letters, do they read them ironically? Do they read them straight-facedly, or like, what is there a kind of tonal shift to them?
It's very dreamy, I would say, because the way they apply this echo effect to voices, you know, it's actually quite a fascinating production, and I know about it in connection to my research of amateur filmmaking in the Soviet Union, because someone made an amateur film of Polin'ka Saks in 1974. He was inspired by the radio drama, and he argued to me that because of Druzhinin's, and that was a person, you know, deep in the provinces in Orenburg Oblast. So he told me that the text was inaccessible to him in the 50s. And his argument, which I don't know how correct it was because it was due to Druzhinin's association with the idea of art for the art's sake. And he went to Moscow to Lenin's library and copied that text by hand there, because he said that was the only way he could read it. So, I mean, it's one private story, but I was curious if there is something more you could tell, or someone else here could tell about the history of this text in the 20th century.
Well, I mean, what ends up happening is that this text, I think, appears in the mid-'80s in academic publication, and in fact in academia, that the great series with Boris Yegorov as the commentator and editor of it, and you know, and the long introduction to, and it's published there together with Historia Alexeya Ivanovича. I mean, maybe I'm not sure. Maybe Alexei remembers this, but which is also really interesting text. But I think that's where the revival or reappearance in publication of this text takes place in the 80s. So yes, Druzhinin was not in, you know, Druzhinin did not fit very well in the kind of genealogy, right, that was being constructed, of Russian criticism that was being constructed in the 20th century. There were dozens of 19th century. Yeah, Alexei is now writing in the 19th. So what does Alexei say? There were dozens of 19th century fiction works that were republished in the 50s after Stalin's death. I see. Yeah, Alexei Dmitrievich, exactly. Thank you. This is Svetlana Grenier. Yeah, sorry. So fascinating stuff about the radio play. I have to look at it.
I think that's all we have, unless anyone wants to ask the last question. Otherwise, we can.
Thank you, everybody, so much. This was so helpful and incredibly exactly what I was hoping for in terms of workshop. Yeah, thank you.